Hello everyone, welcome back. Now in this video, I will talk about Azure Data Factory, how you use Data Factory to move data from one resource to another. In this one, we will particularly use data from SQL database, a table, SQL table, and we'll move it to Azure BLOB container. This is in continuation to the Azure Data Engineer series that I'm creating. Now, before starting, let me introduce myself. I'm Sushil. I'm a certified cloud and DevOps expert. I have more than a decade of industry experience and I've worked on multiple roles on premises, virtual, cloud, DevOps, etc. And I'm passionate about fitness and technology, and I share my knowledge using the blog, thetechguy.in. Now, what we will cover in this video? What is this demo about? First, we will create a storage account and container because we are using it as a source. And then we will create our SQL Server database and a SQL table, which we will be moving to the container. And after that, we will create data factory and the pipeline. The pipeline will copy data from SQL database to the blob. So this is the overall workflow that will happen. We'll create a SQL database, we'll create a storage blob, and then we'll use the data factory pipeline to move data from SQL database to blob. Now, before starting, I mean, this is more like a lab, but before starting, I just want to give the brief background about Azure Data Factory. If somebody who is not familiar with Azure Data Factory, a quick walkthrough. Now, Azure Data Factory, as the name suggests, data factory, it is used to transform data, it is used to tweak data, it is used to analyze data, or whatever you can think are the steps in the data lifecycle or data lifetime. Now, in the big data scenarios, when you're dealing with huge data, there can be a lot of raw, unprocessed data, which can really provide you a lot of valuable insights to different roles, to analysts, to data scientists, or to business leaders, etc. Now, to transform this raw data, you really have to clean it. You have to store it in a way that can be easily analyzed or consumed by different portal or different tools. Probably you want to analyze it, and you are expecting some sort of analytical solution to read and produce some sort of graphical interface, or you're just assuming, or you just want to use the data as an input for machine learning. There can be n number of scenarios where you just really want to use the data. Now, when you want to use the data, you also want that data to be in a form that can be easily consumed. It cannot be raw. It has to be processed, whether structured, semi-structured, depending on what kind of data and what kind of tool we are using. But you really have to have you would like to have the data in some sort of structure that can be easily managed or consumed, and that is where Azure Data Factory comes in. In Azure Data Factory, we can create pipelines. We can use Azure Data Factory to move or transform that data. You can use Azure Data Factory for ETL or ELT operations. It can be, I mean, if you're not familiar with ETL and ELT operations, ETL is basically extract, transform, and load. You extract data from somewhere, you transform it, and you load it to the destination. Or probably, depending on the scenario where you do not want to transform it right away, you just want to load and then eventually want to transform, you would use ELT operations where you will extract, load, and then you will transform. So Azure Data Factory comes into picture when you want to analyze, you want to transform the raw data. The other function that can be that it can do is you can also lift and shift the existing SSIS packages to Azure and run them with all the compatibility in Azure Data Factory. So SSIS integration runtimes also, as we all know, SSIS integration runtimes offers a fully managed service, and that is where Azure Data Factory comes in. Let's jump back to the lab. And as I mentioned, in the lab, we'll have more hands-on. Now we'll start, if you're interested to only learn about the pipeline, you can jump back to the last section. But in this video, the intended audience is someone who has never worked on probably Azure and want to see how the resources are created. So I'll first start with creating the Azure Storage account, container, etc., Azure Data Factory, and then the pipelines. No, sorry, the storage account, the SQL server, then Azure Data Factory, and then the pipelines. I'll create the chapters so that you can easily navigate. Now let's first of all create a storage account. I can go to storage account. You'll usually find the most common services here or the services which you have recently used. If you do not see storage account here, you can search for storage accounts on top, or you can click on create a resource. And when you click on create a resource, you have the storage option here, or you can search here also. Now I can search here and it takes me to marketplace where I can click on storage account and I go to create. Now when I try to create a storage account, this is my subscription, this is my resource group. If you want to create a new resource group, you can click on create a resource group, which I do not want. I can choose a storage account name. Now storage account name has to be unique. When I say unique, it has to be unique globally, not only in your account or in your region. So I use it available. We'll see. Otherwise, the validation will fail. The region, I'll keep the standard. I can choose standard or premium performance. Standard is, premium is faster. It gives you high IO, but premium is also expensive. So I'll not use premium. Premium is usually almost double than the standard. And then you have a redundancy option, whether you want to go with LRS, GRS, which is local, geo, zone, and geo zone. I'll keep LRS. Now, depending on what kind of redundancy you are using, you'll be charged based on that. Since this is lab, I'll just keep LRS. I go to advanced. When I go to advanced, I'll keep everything default, but to walk you through, this is just the security where you can choose your TLS version and you can also choose the hierarchical namespace. This makes this as a gen app storage account, data lake storage account, sorry. And then I can have the access protocols, which we can ignore. You can go to network and I can either choose to allow public network, or I can choose a specific network, virtual network, from where I want to allow, or I can just disable all the public and I can configure a private endpoint. Now I'll choose the enable public because I want to go through the public access, and then I have data protection where you can choose your retention, your soft delete, whether you want to enable soft delete, which I do not want to enable. If you want to enable soft delete, if by chance you delete something, you will have the number of days that you specify to retain the data, and then you can recover data within the time frame. Encryption, you can have Microsoft managed keys or customer managed keys. If you have your own keys which you will use to which you want to use to encrypt, you can choose CMK, and then you can use your vault where you have your keys stored. I do not have it. I'll just go with the default, and then I click on review and I click on let it run the validation, and then I click on create. Now while the storage account is creating the storage account, we will go ahead and create a SQL database also in the backend. Now I can again use the same thing. I can go to SQL databases by searching here. I can click on create resource. I go to SQL database. I click on create. And I choose the same resource group and the database name again. Sorry, first of all, I'll have to choose the server. Now this probably I'll deep dive in some other video where what is the server and what is database. But if you have to remember it, if you have worked on databases in the backend, in your life, you have instances and then you have databases or tables, etc. on your instance. Now the server is basically a sort of instance. You create a server And in this server, you can create your multiple databases. Now, if you do not want to manage all the servers, you can have your managed SQL managed instance where you do not really deal with the server. I mean, even if you create the server, it's not a virtual server, it's a PaaS service where you do not really deal with the server updates, server patching, etc. Microsoft takes care of it, but you still have a server where you can restrict your network, you can manage your resizing, you can do a lot of things with respect to the platform level access, but you will have to create a server. Now, I do not have a server. I'll create a server. And when you are creating a server, the server name has to be unique. Now, this name has to be unique. Again, just like storage account, the SQL server name has to be unique globally. Why? Because the name, I mean, this is a global, this is a URL, or not exactly URL. This is a name or that you will use to log in to the server. Now you can use this to log in from anywhere in the world unless your network allows it, which is why this will be unique, because this gets appended to the name. So I'll choose the same name. I'll choose data or SQL. See, if, for example, if I choose a dummy name, which I'm sure would be, it is already in use. So that is why the name has to be unique. I choose this name, I keep the same location. Authentication method, I'll use both SQL and Azure AD authentication. There are two ways. When you select Azure AD authentication, it just uses the Azure Intra or Azure Active Directory. Now they call it Azure Intra. Azure Active Directory authentication, where Azure accounts can be used to log in. But if I use both SQL and Azure AD authentication, I can create a SQL Server credentials, and then I can log in by either using the SQL Server credentials, or I can log in using a using the Azure account. Now the Azure AD admin, I'll choose the same name, same account that I have. My current account. I'm choosing the current account as my SQL Azure admin. And then when I go to server admin login, I'll use, okay. Now, when you are creating this, there are few things. You'll have to select the size, which I will change. Let me choose a database name. Now, this is where the database, okay. So we are creating this SQL server, and there is something called SQL Elastic Pool, which allows you to merge multiple databases. Now, if your usage is dynamic and you think one database or one server is used probably during the day and another one is used probably during the night, you can really use Elastic Pool to have multiple databases, and the resources are distributed across the servers, and then it allows you to save all the costs. This is probably, I'll deep dive in some other video, because this one is probably is primarily focused on the Azure Data Factory. Now we have created the server. We are not actually created the server. We have just told it what server we want to create, and then I use the database. I Now database name can be anything, because the database is actually created in the server. I create a database, and I can really use any name, and I use dev, and I want to change the, now this is where all the pricing is. I really want to use quite basic, because I don't want to charge anything. Now this is where the vCore and DTU based. vCore is little expensive than DTU. Now DTU is essentially the same thing. I mean, DTU is a way they manage how the underlying resources are consumed, but I'll just use DTU, and I'll just keep the base, or probably I'll use standard, and I and I'll again keep LRS. Networking, I'll keep public endpoint. and I'll edit later to show you what this means. And not now, and create. Now, while this database or the server is creating, if you remember, we first created a storage account. Now we have created a storage account. Now in the storage account, we also want to create a container, because the container is where data is stored, where you contain your data. So pipeline or oops, cannot have and I click the create the container. Now let's wait. This will take some time. Let's wait for the SQL server to be created. So you understood the point. Till now, we created a storage account. We created a container in the storage account. We triggered the SQL server and database creation. And we also want to create a Azure Data Factory, because we will use Data Factory to move data from the database to the container, to the storage account. So we go to click create a new resource. We click on Azure Data Factory, and this is the Data Factory option where I can click on create. I'll use the existing resource group. Now this is my Data Factory name. Why do I keep forgetting? We cannot use underscore for again. And I'll use the default region and I'll keep the v2. I go to next. I'll use configure get later. I'll go to next. The same thing, whether we want private endpoint, we can create private endpoint connections. If you want private endpoint, I'll keep public endpoint. And I do not have a customer managed key. I'll keep default. I do not want to use tags for now. Go to next. And I click on create. Now, till now, we have created the storage account. We have created the container. We have created the SQL server and database. Now, while this Azure Data Factory is the creation is in process, let me go to the SQL Server database. Now, this is database, okay? And this is the server where my database is hosted. If you see, this is the server. Now in server, we have something, a section you can see SQL databases. Now in databases, you can see all the databases which are hosted or which are stored on this particular server. And this is where you will see your elastic pools if you have created elastic pools. Now SQL Server, if I have to access this database, etc., there are two ways. Either I can just use the portal. I can use portal to access the database. Go to one sec. Let me database. Let it load. And the other thing that I can do is I can also use SQL Server Management Studio, which is SSMS, as we all know. I'll probably show you using SSMS, or I can show you using the portal as well. Let me choose SSMS. Let me open SSMS. Now, I was calling it SSMS. If you haven't, if somebody who has not heard of this term, SSMS is basically SQL Server Management Studio. This is a UI or the tool which you use to connect to the SQL servers or SQL databases, if you have to name it that way. Now I can use this server name to log in. I'll show you both the way actually how you use SSMS or how you use the portal. We can use portal also. I use SQL Server authentication. If you remember, there were two options that I told you. We can use SQL Server authentication, or we can use Azure Active Directory also. I've enabled both, but I'll just use the SQL Server authentication. And again, I chose the name, username, and password, which I will choose again. See, it will not work mostly because I have not. Yeah. Oh, it is. Let me log in. Now, this is something that I wanted to show you, and that is why I did not add this option when I created my database. Now, you see, there is a firewall rule where we have to allow, I mean, even if I have my public access enabled, I do not have enabled it specifically. Now, if I go to my server name, SQL Server, and I go to networking, in the networking, I really define I have public network access enabled, but I do not have a I haven't specified where I want to or which one I want to enable. I can actually add a rule where I allow 0000. I mean, I can allow it from everywhere, but that is obviously not the best practice. Now, this is my public IP, which I can add from here, or the SSMS itself is telling me that I can add the IP, which I'll do, and then it logs in. Now I can access my database from here. The other option, if you see, if I refresh this now, I'll mostly see my IP listed here, which it has done on its own, and it has added my IP here, and that is why I'm able to access it. The other option that I can have to connect to my database now, in the SQL, I'm in SQL Server. This is my SQL Server. I can go to database, and this is my database. Now, if I want to connect to a database and you do not want to use SSMS to connect, you have an option called Query Editor. Now, I can use the same way. I've previously faced issues with my certificates. I'll, and I can use the same way, and this is actually the same thing. This is my database, and I can either use query editor, I can use my SSMS, whatever I want to use. Now let me create a table in this database. Now I'll create a table, a very basic table, and then I'm creating a table called give you the tech. I mean this is my table that I'm creating, and I'm just creating the two IDs, three IDs. One is ID, first name, last name, and just the second. Second. So this is the query that I'm running, and in the query, I'm creating a table with three columns: ID, first name, last name, and I'm inserting the value in my column. Okay, and let me run this. Now, when I run this, let me refresh. In the tables, I see this table created. Okay, so till now, again, recap, we created a storage account, we created a container, we created a SQL database, and we used a simple query to create a table, the tech guy or whatever tech guy. Now, I also ran this data factory in parallel. Now, this is the data factory page, which you will see. And if you want to launch Studio, they've really given a huge icon. I can click on Launch Studio. Takes me to the studio. It will take a couple of seconds to load. Okay. Now I can click on ingest, or I can go to this and I can author. I can use anything. I can I'll click on ingest, and this is where I use copy data tool. Now I will use built-in copy data tool, and it is just once. You can schedule, or you can have tumbling window also. I'll use run once. Now this is the source data store. If you remember, we created table. Now our source will be SQL database. So I click on new connection and I search for, I can do this, or I can just search SQL, Azure SQL database. Click on continue, SQL database connection. Now there is an integration runtime. We can use Azure integration runtime, we can use self-hosted integration runtime, or we can use an existing linked integration runtime. Now self-hosted basically helps us to copy data from the external, and that is why we are using self-hosted integration runtime. Now integration runtime actually can run copy activities between cloud data source and self-hosted. I mean, this particular self-hosted integration runtime is capable of running copy activity between a cloud data source and a data source in a private network. Now, that is what we are doing here. Our SQL database and the blob container, and we're using a self-hosted integration runtime. Now I can use the Azure also for data flow within Azure, and we can use it for on-premises and private network. Now, why I'm doing this is I just want to show you. Now we are used Azure SSMS. Now it could have been a scenario where you were using an SQL database, SQL server on-premises. Where I mean, if it was an on-premises, you would use the same SSMS way. I mean, this is the SSMS, and I go to databases. This is my database, and I've already created the table. If I go to tables, and this is the table that I created. Second, this is the table that I created, and I just have columns, whatever. Now consider this as your on-premises SQL database. And in that scenario, we would use the self-hosted integration runtime. Now I'll go ahead with this, and we can name it anything. I'll just name it self-hosted. I'll click on create, and it tells you to download an integration runtime, which I've already done on my machine. I've already installed, but you can use this key to connect to this Azure. See, I installed my integration runtime, but how does it know this integration runtime has to register? I mean, which data factory it is registered to, where it has to send data, how it has to communicate, and that is where this authentication key comes in. I use my authentication key and I register, or I register, and it will try to authenticate using the I mean authentication key. If you really want to see, complete this first. If you really want to see what this key is about, it is just IR, and it actually has everything. This is my data factory name, my endpoint. This is my data factory endpoint. Actually, the tech guy dot eastus dot data factory dot azure, and then it has the key with it. So my integration runtime is, it is connecting, or it is trying to authenticate and set up the connection with my data factory. Okay, so the registration is complete. Now it says the self-hosted node is connected. This is my data factory. It is self-hosted, and the node, it uses the node in the backend, and the node is my machine. My machine name is this. Now we can go to settings, and we can change proxy. I do not have a proxy. If you have a proxy, you can add your proxy here. But if you had a proxy, then the connection itself would have failed. You can, it had an option to select your proxy, so you can really do that. And you can enable remote access, which I want to show you. Now, this is where I can enable remote access. I do not have certificate, so I'll just choose enable without my certificate, and I'll choose the port. Now, TCP port, I want to use 1443 because that is the SQL port that we have. And then I click on OK. Now you can really change all these settings, and that is how your remote connection access, etc. is working. And I'll have to restart my node, and let me restart and come back. Okay, so we are back. Now you'll see the agent here. If you do not really see it, you can refresh, and after you refresh, you'll see the connection is set up. And because we are trying to connect the SQL database, it will ask you where the SQL database is hosted. You can use Azure subscription, and then my SQL server name is this one. It automatically searched it, and it will check the database. Now this is the database that I created, and I'll use the SQL authentication which I'm using so far. Let connect. Now it is testing connection. Let's give it some time. Perfect. So the connection completed, and it is trying to load the existing tables, which it will see it here. This is the table that I have. If you have had other tables, you would see all the tables. And I go to next. I can preview data if I want. Now this is the data. If you remember, I ran the query and I created the dummy data, just 2 columns, and this is the data that I created. I go to next. Now I have to choose the destination. Now we have selected source, and now we select the destination, and we want to store data in blob storage. That is what we will choose. We'll use blob, and we'll use blob. And the authentication type is, you can either use account key, you can use service principal, anonymous, etc. I'll use account key, and I go to my storage account. My storage account, and I have my access keys option here. This is where you get your access keys, and I can show, or I can copy, I can show, and this is my access key for my storage account. Using this storage account, this is using this key, any resource which is trying to access my storage account can authenticate itself. So this is my storage account, and sorry, this is my storage account. Second. And why don't Okay, so I've selected this storage account, and I can click on test connection, which it's okay. It's not asking me the key because it already has the access. I click on connect, and it will connect to my storage account. So what we have done, we have chosen source, we have chosen destination, and I can choose the container that this is the container that I created. This is the container that you see here, and I want to copy data in my container. Right now, my container is empty. You do not really see anything in the container. So I copy data in this container. I can specify the file name. If I don't, then it will choose the default. The table name will be my file name. And what type of data, what will be the file format? I'll choose the default delimited text, CSV. And then I go to next. And this is my pipeline name. It's fine. I'll use the same name. and I go to next, and this is where you can view what you're doing. This is my pipeline name. My source is Azure SQL database connection. My destination is blob, and it's copying data. Next, and it will do it in a couple of seconds. So my pipeline completed. I can edit pipeline, I can monitor, or if I can finish and I can go to monitor, I can finish and I can go to monitor, and here I see my pipeline runs. And if I want to see how my pipeline performed, I can go to my pipeline runs. This is on this tab. I go to monitor. In the monitor, I go to pipeline runs, and this is my pipeline run. I can just refresh and we'll see the activity status completed. And now this completed and it copied data. Now if I go to my container, I click on refresh and I see my file created here. And this is the file, and this is the CSV generated data. So basically what we did is, let's recap what we have done. We talked about data factory. We created storage account and container. We created SQL database and table, and then eventually we created a data factory pipeline to copy the data. I hope this video helped. And if this video helped, please subscribe and let me know in the comment section if there is anything else that you want me to talk about or something else that you want me to cover. Thank you. Have a good day.